What I want to do in this session is look a little bit at how these things happen in other parables. I'm not saying they happen in every single other parable, but I want to show you just the cleverness of some of Jesus' other parables. So here we're starting in the next chapter of Luke, Luke chapter 16, and it's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. That's Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. And there we read that, and what I want to highlight here is again how Jesus says a lot with a few words. That's a sign of cleverness. And so at the rich man's gate, and you're told about his gate, which already implies something about the size of the property, was laid a poor man. Now, with that phrase "was laid," it's just one word in Greek. It's already telling you that the poor man needed help to get there. So it never says he's a poor disabled man, but he is a poor disabled man. It implies that because he's laid there, and of course it's a strategic place. Every time the rich man goes in and out, he's only got one gate. He has to go past the poor man, and he's ignoring him every single time. And the poor man is named Lazarus. Now this is brilliant. The rich man is not named, even though everyone at the time would have known his name. The poor man, who everyone ignores, his name is known because he mattered more to God. And he's covered with sores and so on. Then we read that the poor man died. Then the rich man died and was buried. Now you notice what goes on here. The poor man dies before the rich man. That is generally the way life works. The poor people tend to live less long. Jesus has that in his parable. The poor man dies. But it doesn't say the poor man died and was buried. It says the rich man died and was buried. But by not telling you that the poor man was buried, you sort of wonder, was he buried? So again, Jesus is using very few words, but getting a lot into the story. But whereas the rich man is buried, the poor man is given an angelic VIP welcome to Abraham's side. Then we have this beautiful thing where the rich man says, I've got 5 brothers. Let him go and tell them, warn them, so they don't come to this place of torment. And Abraham says they have Moses and the prophets. Well, remember that there are 5 books of Moses. So there's a sort of numerical link there between having 5 brothers and Moses and the prophets that's very clever. So there's a lot going on at that level with the story. But also there's Old Testament reference. Now, when you read Luke 15 through to 16, chapter 15 tells you you've got 2 groups of 2 people, scribes, Pharisees, tax collectors, and sinners. Chapter 16 verse 1 tells you he then talks to his disciples, but then you learn in the middle of the chapter that the Pharisees are still listening and despising him, and then he tells this story. So I think the Pharisees and the scribes still hear. And so Jesus is telling this parable, and he tells you about a man who is a rich man who's clothed in purple and fine linen and feasted sumptuously every day. Well, if you're a scribe, and you run through your mental concordance, there's only one place in the entire Old Testament that you get purple and fine linen together and feasting. And that is the first chapter of Esther. And Esther is a very, very commonly copied out scroll. And so we read in the days of Ahasuerus, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast, and the feast went on for 180 days. Then he has a 7-day feast at the end of that. And in chapter 1, verse 6, you read about how the decorations, he's got linen and purple. Now that's quite an interesting reference, but you think, what's going on there? Is there any purpose to that? Well, there's another reference here, and that is that there's another group of people who feast every day, and that is Job's children. But we'll come to those in a minute, because not only does he feast every day, but there's a poor man covered with sores. Well, who is the only person in the Bible covered with sores? It is, of course, Job. And then, as we read the story, Jesus tells that the rich man is in Hades, and he lifts up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. Well, in the book of Job, we read that Job's sons used to hold a feast in the house of each son on his day. Now, some people understand the phrase on his day to mean on his birthday. But you could understand it because he's got 7 sons. As a 7-day week, they each have a feast every day. They're feasting every day. And the thing about Job's sons is they invite their sisters and they have this cycle of feasts. It seems to be a sibling only feast. So it's brothers and sisters. They may have others, but we don't know about that. And Job is pious, and he therefore sacrifices at the end of each period on their behalf in case they've sinned. Now, what we then read is that Satan goes and he struck Job with loathsome sores. Then his 3 friends come, and his 3 friends, what do? They lift up their eyes from afar. And these are the only times, there's only 2 times in the entire Bible you get people lifting up their eyes from afar, other than Luke 16. One of them is here in Job. So there are quite a few references to Job in this story. And of course, one of the things about Job is Job was rich. There's nothing wrong with being rich. Abraham comes up a lot in this parable. Abraham was rich. So rich isn't the problem. There's another problem we'll look at. But whereas Job looked after his servants, he could say he never turned anyone away. Actually, this rich man, is quite different. Now, what happens then? The rich man lifts up his eyes and he sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. There we have, I've actually blended 2 verses there. That's misprinted here on this slide. I've actually put in the verse from Genesis there on the end of Luke 16. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes from afar. Here it is, Genesis 22. In the passage where Abraham offers up his son Isaac, it says, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. There's only one place in the Bible where you get the 4 things together: lift up, eyes, from afar, and Abraham. So, in other words, the language of Jesus's parable comes from this famous story. Abraham is also the person in the Bible who is most often said to lift up his eyes and see. It doesn't always come through in modern translations. You sometimes get rid of that idiom, but it's there in more literal translations. Now, what does the rich man call out? He calls out 3 times, Father Abraham. He calls out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Or I beg you, Father. Or no, Father Abraham. 3 times he calls Abraham his father. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem is this: how many sons does Abraham have? Abraham has more offspring than you can count. He's got as many offspring as the stars, as many offspring as the sand, the things you can't count. So what you see here is that the rich man has made a very big mathematical mistake. The rich man thinks he has 5 brothers and that he can call Abraham his father. But hang on, if Abraham's his father, then Lazarus is his brother too. So he can't go past Lazarus and ignore him every day. So when he says, I've got 5 brothers, and Abraham says, they've got Moses and the prophets, it's a reminder. If the rich man had read Moses and the prophets, he would have seen that he could not ignore his brother Lazarus. And it's very interesting because what we have is we have the story of the prodigal son, in which the older brother does not recognize his younger brother. Do you know what the older brother calls his younger brother? He says to his father, this son of yours. When this son of yours came back, you killed the fatted calf for him. He denies his brotherhood. That's exactly what the rich man in this story is doing. He is denying Lazarus. And of course, he's denying Lazarus is his brother, and that's why he ends up in the torment of Hades. And Hades, the reason Jesus can use that Greek word is not because he's thinking about having the river Styx and Charon and Cerberus the dog and all these sorts of things from Greek mythology, because there's one idea that's right about Hades, and that is that the Greeks had right. That is that there is an exact justice corresponding to what people have done. Just as Lazarus's sores burned him, so, and he was licked by the tongues of the dogs, so here the rich man's tongue is burning and he's just longing for water to be refreshed. But he's made this major mistake in mistaking who his brothers are and thinking that he can have Abraham as his father and not have Lazarus as his brother. I want to come on to another story. Again, it's from Luke, and this is the story of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And what's very interesting about this story is that Jesus has an expert in the Jewish law. An expert in the Jewish law comes along and tests Jesus. And so this is a test. What must I do to inherit eternal life? It's a really good test, isn't it? And so Jesus then has his two counter questions. So it's not just counter questions in Luke. You get counter questions in Matthew. You also get counter questions in Luke. In the law, what's written? So he turns his eye to the Bible, and then how do you read it? So very challenging morally. At this point, the expert in the law gives the perfect answer. We know it's the perfect answer. The perfect answer is love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We know it's the perfect answer because it's an answer Jesus himself has given to that question. So it has to be a perfect answer. So really well done to that scribe. He's got everything right. So then Jesus says, do this and you will live. Okay. Why does he say this? In fact, the word order of Jesus is important. He says, this do, not do this do, and you will live. Well, the expert says, yeah. I'm paraphrasing. But the word neighbor is a bit difficult to understand. Don't we need to do some hermeneutics on what the word neighbor means? I mean, it's got all these different meanings. And how are we supposed to know what a neighbor is? So I've got which two commands, but it's a bit tricky to know what practically to do about them. Now, the question is this. Jesus, and Jesus does these Old Testament references, particularly when he's engaging experts, supposed experts in the Bible. They think they're experts in the Bible. Do they know the Bible as well as he does? Can the expert remember the one place in the Bible? There's only one place where someone says, this do, and you will live. Where does someone say, this do, and you will live? Well, then Jesus tells a story. And it's a story of a man who is stripped naked and abandoned. Well, hang on. The only time that anyone says, this do and you will live, is when Joseph says it to his brothers who don't yet know it's Joseph. But the last time Joseph had seen his brothers was when they stripped him and left him naked and abandoned in a pit. So that's a really striking thing, because there you see Jesus is aligning himself with Joseph. Joseph is the one who was abandoned by his brothers. And so Jesus is therefore aligning himself with the injured man in the story. But also, when we get to the end of the story, he says, who do you think was the neighbor to the man? And actually, there is this interesting question, because people often think that the question was the wrong way round. what we see is that the Samaritan was like a neighbor. And so there we see that, in fact, Jesus aligns himself with the injured man and with the man who comes to the rescue. Because in the gospel, that's what Jesus does. That's how eternal life comes about. Because Jesus came to rescue us when we were weak and fallen and naked and in peril. But also, he was the one who was wounded for us. And so there is this wonderful subtlety to this little bit of wording, this do and you will live, that Jesus uses at the beginning as he's talking to a Bible expert. Now, whether the Bible expert saw that or not, I have no idea, but that is something that's going on. So far, what you've seen is we've looked at some parables, Luke 15, Luke 16. We've looked at the story of the Good Samaritan there from Luke 10. You say, aha, that's all in Luke. Can you show me that elsewhere? Can you show me it, for instance, in Matthew? Yes, I can. Now, remember that most of the largest body of Jesus's speech is in Matthew, followed by Luke, followed by John, followed by Mark. So although Luke's is the longest gospel, actually you've got a bit more of quite a bit more of Jesus's speech as a whole in Matthew. And of course, Matthew and John, who are the two eyewitnesses amongst the four gospel writers, are the two who write the longest discourses of Jesus. So whether it's the lesson on the Mount or the final discourse in John, the longest ones are recorded by the people who are actually there, which I think is an interesting point. So what we see here is actually there are other references to the Old Testament within parables, for instance, in Matthew. Now, these are not of the same kind, because at the end of the day, Jesus isn't talking to Bible experts in all of these. But for instance, the parable of the sower, at the end, it says that there is a crop of 30, 60, or 100-fold, 100 times more. And 100 times more, that's the crop which you read Isaac had in Genesis chapter 26. So I think the number comes from that. But also there's that wonderful passage in Jeremiah chapter 4, where they're told not to sow amongst thorns, which I think is possibly behind that parable. We should consider it. We've already talked about the leaven, the parable of the leaven in Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. This is the second of those down, relating to Genesis 18. That's another number. A third case, here says a number, the unforgiving servant. This is, remember, you've got one servant who owes 10,000 talents and one who owes 100 talents. Well, that's quite like the book of Esther, because Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is the king, and he's got two people below him. He's got Haman, who offers him 10,000 talents, and Haman wants to inflict punishment and get rid of Mordecai, who's also below Haman. And of course, what you find out in the book of Esther is that all being reversed. What he had intended to do to the more junior, the less important person, what Haman had intended to do to Mordecai gets done to Haman, very much like in Jesus's story of the unforgiving servant. So I think there's a paradigm there based off Esther. The parable of the vineyard workers is very commonly thought to be related to Isaiah chapter 5, where it will talk about digging a wine vat and all sorts of things which are similar to Jesus's parable. The parable of the wise and foolish virgins, you could look at a proverb like Proverbs 13 verse 9, the light of the wicked, the righteous will rejoice, but the light of the wicked will go out. The parable of the sheep and the goats, Matthew chapter 25. You have this language in Ezekiel chapter 24 about the discerning between the sheep, one sheep and another sheep, between the rams and the goats. And that's what God does as a shepherd. So I think that Jesus is bathed in the Old Testament. He loves the Old Testament. He loves the Word of God. And this provides so many of the categories for his parables, his teaching, it goes very deep. So I want now to move on from parables to some other aspects of Jesus' teaching. I just want to consider this. I don't know Chinese. I just think Chinese looks really beautiful, and there are probably some people from who speak Chinese on this call. So God bless you. It's not just that Jesus is this phenomenal storyteller who can tell parables. He also has some of the most phenomenal ethical teaching that there is. For instance, the golden rule. Now, the first person to have the golden rule attributed to him is Jesus. It's attributed to him in Matthew and in Luke. So here is Matthew's version, Matthew 7, verse 12. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. This is the law and the prophets. Now, remember, that's in the context of a brilliant set of teaching, which has Beatitudes very based on the Old Testament, but also with Greek alliteration, all sorts of other clever things going on in that, lots of morally challenging teaching about, it's got the Lord's Prayer and so on. In that same context, you have this rule. Now, a generation before Jesus, Rabbi Hillel had managed to put this in a negative form. What you don't like, don't do. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the law. Now, Jesus is the first person who has this attributed to him. Now, someone might say, how do we know Jesus said that? Well, either Jesus said it, or he had very clever disciples who came up with brilliant ideas and then attributed them to him. The simplest view is, of course, that he came up with them. So the simple view is the brilliant stories come from Jesus, the brilliant ethical teaching comes from Jesus. There's no better way of analyzing it. And Confucius, several hundred years before Jesus, didn't come up with anything quite as sharp. Again, it's negative as a golden rule. Whatever you do not want yourself, do not force onto others. But I want to give you another area where Jesus is quite brilliant, and it's been a very topical area, and that is the area of the non-binary. Actually, Jesus knows about non-binary things. I believe that there are two sexes, male and female, but some people are not born classically in quite the typical form. There are differences of sexual development. There are chromosomal differences that people can have. Well, Jesus, all those years ago, when he was asked about marriage, talked about three categories of people who don't marry. And he says, for some people who have been eunuchs, have been so from birth, some have been made that by others, some who make themselves that for the kingdom. Now, of course, a eunuch before this time was, the idea came from Persians who would castrate men so that they could supposedly be safe as they looked after the king's harem. That was the idea, be more trustworthy or whatever. But by analogy, of course, the same language can be used of males and females. And here Jesus says, some people are born such that they can't marry. Some people are born atypical. So in other words, right all those years ago, Jesus is talking about the same sort of things that people talk about today. What about people being atypical? Is it possible for people not to be the typical male and not to be the typical female, but still to be amazingly valuable in the image of God? And Jesus says, yes. That's another example of very smart teaching. So overall, what do we make of it? Well, Jesus is the Word. Everything was made through him. He invented language. He invented everything. He made the world. He invented human language. He superintended the development of every language. He made the book of Genesis. He superintended the book of Genesis. He superintended even the words of Pilate, who said, you are the king of the Jews, in such a way that it could be, are you the king of the Jews, or you are? Everything he's sovereign over. He is amazing. And he also sees through human casuistry. Humans tend to use their cleverness to run away from God. And Jesus' call to us is to listen and to hear God. So I went on slightly longer than I intended there, and maybe a very brief time for maybe one question, but then we need to get on.
Well, thank you, Peter. We have a few minutes for some questions.
Right.
So we will start with this one here, asking, how can we read so as to notice these types of connections?
Well, I think you take Psalm 1. Psalm 1, blessed is the man who, does these various things and meditates on the law of God day and night. How does he meditate in the night? Not because he has a lamp, but because he has memorized the words during the day, and then he meditates them, means cast them over in his mind, asking how they apply. So I think that you want to think practically, casting these words over. Don't do it on your own. Do it in a local church. Do it on your own as well as in a local church and in small groups. I learn a huge amount from my Bible study. So although I'm supposed to be an expert on the Bible, I don't feel I know very much about it. But I sit and I learn things from folk in my house group, and it's just fantastic. And so I would say, learn with people and put it into practice. And Jesus said, whoever has more will be given. As you understand more, as you follow more, he will give more. He has infinite amounts to give.
Great, thank you. Our next question asks, thinking in human terms, how much of Jesus's Old Testament references are intentional, and how much is it the result of a Jewish teacher whose thinking is formed through Old Testament study?
I don't know. I can't put a percentage on it. I mean, I do think what's going on in the book of in the story of the two sons is a sort of deliberate, careful crafting of a story. But I do think there's a certain amount that you're bathed in it, and you don't necessarily always know exactly where it comes from. So I don't know the extent of Jesus's knowledge. At one level, I mean, he's God and therefore omniscient, but it's like he closes off computer files, so he doesn't access the knowledge to when he's returning. Now, I don't know whether there are other things he doesn't access to knowledge to. I just don't know. But I'd want to say that God makes Jesus's life perfect. Every word is as well expressed as it possibly can be. It's deeply mysterious, the incarnation and the dynamics of that, and we don't understand that. But I want to say, God is deliberate about every atom. So that takes you 100% if you want a percentage on things.
Okay, I think we'll do one more question. This one reads, the comparisons are very interesting, but can we really compare what the Old Testament says and what Jesus says in his teaching, since it's different languages?
So I think Jesus is, I don't think languages is a big problem. I mean, we have this session in several languages, and language isn't a real issue. In Acts chapter 7, or Acts chapter 6, Greek-speaking people object to what Stephen is saying and drag him into the Sanhedrin. And then Stephen, who's a Greek speaker, gives a speech. And the Sanhedrin gets by. There would be people with different language knowledge in the Sanhedrin, some more comfortable in Greek, some more comfortable in Hebrew. I think in multilingual settings, people have ways of getting by. And sometimes you can't even remember what a conversation was in. So language is not a barrier to God's word getting out in that way. I'm just going to start at the top because anything else would be arbitrary. With the abundance of alliteration assonance, how does it impact how biblical studies have traditionally been done? Well, I would say often people haven't really noticed that. There's been a tendency in recent years, I think, to ignore the possibility of Jesus speaking Greek and people have tended to see this as something that's just from the evangelists or their sources, from Q, a hypothetical source, and so on. So I am making a bit of a challenge to that. And I think when you read Matthew 5 through to 7 as a whole, you see there's a lot of that going on. So I would, that's the way I would take it. I don't know what Jesus's IQ would be. Someone's asked about that. I just don't know how we would get onto that unless we're going to say infinite and so on. So I think we'll probably leave it there. But I just really encourage you to get on with those evaluations and come back to future masterclasses that will be done by people who are more masters and more expert than me on different subjects. They're really, really great. And have a good morning, evening, or whatever it is in your time zones. And thank you to our wonderful translators.